Chase, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, great. Happy to be here.
Good to be here. Exciting season, right? Just kidding. Complete sarcasm if you couldn't tell. Chase, first of all, I really, before we start, getting into the nitty-gritty of, Michigan State's film and other things sort of, into the weeds, obviously, I really want to get your opinion on, what Michigan State's season was like and, how those analysts or analyses like sort of broke down, week by week, like how the season sort of grew between the highs and the lows.
Yeah, so I don't think there's really any way that the season can be classified other than a disappointment, right? I think most people that were rational observers and consumers of Michigan State football imagined that there'd be, somewhat of a step back after what you saw last year, and I didn't think it would be this much of a step back. I thought you'd maybe be talking about 8, 9 wins, something like that, but nothing like what we've seen. And as you kind of look at the body of work over the season, you start with a couple games against directional school and a MAC school that, you get the job done, but there's holes, right? And maybe with the exception of the Akron game, but even there, before an injury, you're seeing a lot of off coverage, a defense that doesn't really trust each other that much, and an offense that's largely unimaginative, right? And then a lot of that comes to a head at Washington, and that lays bare a lot of the issues with the team. You start to rack up some injuries, and then it really kind of goes into a death spiral, talking about the Minnesota game, which was a pretty grisly low. The Ohio State game wasn't pretty. You beat a bad Wisconsin team, right, and kind of despite yourself when you look at how that game ended. But there were some good things to see there. I think about this time going into the bye week, defense gets a little bit more healthy. You see a little bit more creativity as far as disguising coverages, mixing coverages, things like that. Do a pretty good job as far as containing an explosive running game against Michigan, but what does that look like? It just looks like instead of giving up 50, 60-yard runs like Ohio State was doing yesterday, you're looking at giving up 177 yards to Blake Corum and 5 and 6 yard pieces, right? And when you mix that with only scoring 7 points, there's just not a whole lot to talk about there. And then you're able to scratch out a win over Rutgers. You're able to beat a solid Illinois team, and I think what was pretty much unquestionably the best win of the season. And then just a grisly loss to Indiana, and then you end the season just with really kind of a whimper yesterday. It's ugly, and there's a lot of questions going forward, and it's not going to be a pleasant offseason.
So we know that Michigan State lacked depth, right? We knew obviously last year, the defense wasn't good, even with the 11-2, one season, 11-1, right? Even with that Peach Bowl winning season, it still wasn't, there wasn't a ton to like about the defense. And we expected, like Mel Tucker said before the season started, like, it can't get worse, but it feels worse. Obviously it does. So we know that Michigan State lacks depth, but when you observe them, do you think that this is mainly to do with coaching or a talent-related issue?
Yeah, it's a number of things. I think, so at least last year, Michigan State had a nasty front seven, right? And Michigan, though they got 145 yards on the ground against Michigan State in 2021, it didn't feel like that. They were consistently in 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 11 type scenarios. And you had a strong run defense. I think Jacob Slade, I said it, I think in the preseason, I think he's the pound-for-pound best defensive tackle in the Big Ten. And I think that's still true. So you lose him, I think, in the first game, right? You lose your a very rangy linebacker who's excellent in coverage in Darius Snow for this season. And then, you lose Xavier Henderson for large parts of the season. Right there, you're talking about in your first 2 games, you've lost probably your best player at every level of the defense. That doesn't help, right? And you could see when Henderson and Slade were back healthy on the field, the defense looked a lot better. And there's also an element of trust there in that they've both been with the defense for 3 years. I don't think it's an accident that when they come back, and specifically when Henderson comes back with what he does from a communication aspect, you start to see more split coverages. You start, like a cover 5. You start to see more disguise coverages. You start to see them, trusting. Hazelton starts to trust his guys to play more man defense because you can afford to do that when you can get a pass rush, right? And you have that, and the defense looks better, but at the end of the day, it's still not good. And I think at the end of the day, Mel Tucker's been pretty unambiguous about wanting to win championships. And on each side of the ball, I don't think you can say that you have a championship level coordinator. Hazelton is better. He is a better coach. I've watched a few of his clinics and consumed some of the media that he and his camp have put out. I think he's a better coach than the defense has shown. But ultimately, you are what your record says you are. I think if it's kind of interesting. For about the first half of the season, the narrative is that, well, the offense is fine, but we need a new defensive coordinator. And then the second half of the season, it's, oh my God, we need a new offensive coordinator. And some of the heat's come off Hazelton a little bit, I felt like. I think if you're serious about wanting to win a championship, you probably need to replace them both. But sticking purely on the defensive side of the ball, I think there is a coaching issue there. I think the best defense that Hazelton had finished about 40th, and that was a year at Kansas State. You can have a defensive revolution over the course of an offseason and have it completely change the outlook of your entire program. I mean, Michigan's done it twice in the last 2 years. It can happen. There's a lot of young, up-and-coming defensive coordinators that I think are ready to take that next step. I love guy at Oregon State. I've been watching him all year, Trent Bray. I think he's excellent. He really did a number on USC when they played earlier. There's young talent out there that I would, if I'm in Michigan State shoes, I'd be taking a look at on the defensive side of the ball. In the beginning of the season, Michigan State played a ton of off coverage, a ton of country cover 3, country quarters, where people they're guarding grass, they're not defending players. There's fundamentals, fundamental breakdowns, there's miscommunication, and some of that can be chalked up to injuries, absolutely. But when you're in your second season of this, not kind of disregarding the COVID season, at some point it's a feature, not a bug. And at that point, I'd be ready to move on from Scotty Hazelton.
In your opinion, do you think MSU will realistically do that? I know maybe that's not your area of expertise, but based off what you said, I would agree that it's time to maybe make a change. But do you think that will happen right away?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have or pretend to have any sources inside the program or any insight there.
Right.
But there's no secret that it's a problem. I think kind of the fear is that for a lot of the reasons that people say, hey, people are talking a lot about Mel Tucker, guy needs some more time. You could just as easily apply that rationale to the assistant coaches. I would not personally do that. I would move on from both of them. But I think just my gut is that you will see a coordinator change this offseason, but probably not both.
Okay.
That's just my gut. It's not based on anything whatsoever. But I think the hope would be that you bring in someone who's young, who has recruiting chops, and who also has, even if it's not necessarily an innovative scheme, a scheme that's going to work.
Yeah, I was saying that earlier too, how I want one to leave, at least one. I think that's always been my opinion ever since the middle of the season. I mean, I don't know. It at some point it gets so infuriating, and I think that nothing was more infuriating than, as you mentioned, that Grizzly loss to Indiana.
Yeah.
Can you dissect what went wrong? I mean, how do they blow a lead like that? I believe at the time that I was watching the game, at the time that the game was going on, I was actually covering a Michigan State hockey game. So
Right.
I didn't actually get to see the crushing loss. Instead, I get to see, this team just basically, fall flat. Because I was like, oh, they're up, 24-7. I'm like, that's great. And what happened? Like, in your eyes, what happened there?
It's multiple organ failure. It was on multiple levels of from a execution, from a personnel, from a schematic standpoint. Everything fell apart. I watched that game 3 times, and I how do you lose that game, right? I really felt that Hazleton was probably never going to have a great defense at Michigan State, a school and a program that prides itself on playing great defense. But I did think that it could be functional, and you felt that you were turning a corner towards that until that happened, because Indiana, I think, had 7 passing yards in regulation, and from a fundamental standpoint, Michigan State could not defend any of the mesh point read option stuff that Indiana was doing. And Indiana wasn't doing anything that they hadn't done before. It's a Walt Bell offense. They're going to option guys off. They're going to run a lot of screens. They're going to try to spread you out, make easy reads in both the pass game and the run game, and try to get easy yards. And Michigan State got stuck in their base defense. You didn't have the linebacker talent on the field, which isn't necessarily Hazleton's fault, but you didn't have the linebacker talent to stop that. I know I charted one play where you had a trio bunch to the field, and then you had a single wide receiver, and it just split the 2 linebackers. I think it was Halliday and Van Sumeren. It split them out so far where neither one of them could effectively defend anything, and you had a safety running the alley, and it was a quarterback option. You're one-on-one. If you miss that guy, I think it was Kendall Brooks. If Brooks misses that, if he's not able to make a tackle in the C gap, it's going for a touchdown. And then it comes down to fundamentals, where instead of taking on a blocker and pushing him back in the hole or spilling, he hops outside thinking someone's covering for him. Nobody's covering for him because Halliday got scooped. And I think Sean Shivers goes for like 79 yards, right? So there's that aspect of it where you have a personnel problem, you have a scheme problem, and you have an execution kind of fundamental problem, right? And then there's things like giving up a kick return and missing a makeable field goal after one of your best drives of the day where you could get out of Dodge with a victory. You have the offense kind of disappearing in the second half. You have just a galaxy-brained double tight end seam schemed up for a 4th and 2 where you have Keon Coleman wide open. It's like the play design sucks, and also your quarterback is missing somebody who's wide open in the flat. And I guess that leads into an offensive discussion if you guys want to go there about kind of the architecture of the offense, because I think there's kind of been holistic problems with that all season too.
That was going to be my next question. So talk to me a little bit about Peyton Thorne throughout the season and what you saw from him, the good and the bad and the different from maybe what you saw last season.
So I think it's fair to say that he regressed. His footwork, I never played quarterback. I'm not a quarterback guru. People who are smarter than me have told me that his footwork was poor, that his just fundamentally his shoulder work, things like that, it was poor and not as good as it was last year. Obviously, that's an issue. I also think he was really hurt by the fact that he did not have Jaden Reed and Jalen Naylor on the field at the same time, right? Because all of a sudden, Reed, who is a very good player, not a superlative player, but a very good player, is getting everybody's number 1 corner assignment, right? And when you're in the Big Ten, there's going to be a lot of good corners. And so you don't have kind of a secondary option there. You have decent pass-catching tight ends, but guys who struggle with their fundamentals as well. And you don't have the threat of the play action that you did with Kenneth Walker when people were terrified to put 2 safeties high because you had to defend against the run. So it makes everything more difficult from kind of a schematic perspective. And then when you take into account the fact that he personally, I'm told, has gotten worse and his footwork and things like that have regressed. And the offensive line was not great last year, but it was poor this year, and he was taking a lot of hits and getting dinged up. It kind of all went wrong for him, and it just didn't work. I would bet that he's your starting quarterback next year too, and you'll just have to see, I guess, what kind of transpires over the offseason there, whether he gets better Does the offensive line improve? What sort of weapons are we talking about that can supplement a guy like Keon Coleman as a true number one? And where does he go from here? But he regressed, and the scheme did him no favors.
Just to wrap up real quick, I really just want to get, what did you think, or where do you think that MSU goes from here? Like, do you have any early predictions for the season next year?
I mean, I think it's going to be a youth movement. I think I would be very surprised if they won less than probably 7 games next year. But it's going to be tough. I mean, I think you might be able to see. I think next year is going to be very informative as far as where things go as a program. I don't think the team is going to be. The hope is that you're ready to compete in 24 and 25. I don't think it's reasonable to expect competition for a Big Ten title next year. I wouldn't say that it might not be fair to compete to expect competition for a Big Ten title, but I don't think it's realistic to expect them to contend. I think you're probably looking at a 7 or 8 win season, and it's going to have. There's going to be a lot of very, very young players on the field. It's going to be an absolute youth movement. So you are going to see missed assignments. You're going to see guys aligned wrong. You're going to see penalties as kids grow as players. And that's okay if you see growth and, hey, this is a scheme that can work on the offensive and defensive side of the ball. People are getting their fundamentals right. People are doing the easy things right. Even though they're young, they're making the plays that they should make. If you're seeing those things, you can take some solace in the fact that the youthful indiscretions aren't going to last forever, right? But if you see kind of the holistic failure this year that you saw this year, it's going to be ugly. So it's a not a make or break season. I think those will come in 24 and 25, but it's a very important season. You're going to see a lot of youth, hopefully a lot of growth, and hopefully a more successful season than you saw this year.
All right. Well, yeah, we hope to. I mean, anything again. I don't know. In my opinion, less than 8 wins is not, unacceptable, right? Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Anyway, thanks, Chase, and we are going to take a quick break, and we will be right back.